Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders and family members past, present, and emerging. So my name is Dr. Charlene Naik. I'm a researcher at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research, and an inducer of beeping. I'm also an occasional host of Ask the Doctor and Catalyst. And for those of you who are following, you probably hate me because I'm doing all these experiments saying how bad sugar and alcohol is for you, which kind of sucks for me too. But anyway, that's not the purpose of today. It's to introduce our speaker for today at the VCCC. So Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre is an alliance of 10 successful Victorian organisations committed to cancer control, and you can see that here. You can see the institutions here. Its role is to coordinate the collaboration between its member organisations and to develop a strategic program of work that integrates research, education, and clinical care to maximise patient outcomes in a cost-effective manner. So we have some really interesting speakers coming up, as you can see on the screen here. I won't go through all of them, but please do come along for these. They're a great opportunity to delve deeper into various topics around health and medicine, or in this case, the journalism around that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Misha Ketchel. I was very excited when asked to host this talk because the conversation has been a staple part of my diet for a number of years. And I really wanted to get deeper into understanding what the model looks like, what Misha's experience is, what journalism looks like now and into the future, especially as it pertains to health and medicine, which, as many of us know, is rife with all kinds of nonsense and a few nuggets of gold, and it's hard to figure out those nuggets sometimes. So Misha is an editor at The Conversation. He's been a journalist for more than 20 years, and in previous roles was the founding editor of The Big Issue Australia, which we all know and love, the editor of Crikey, The Reader, and the Melbourne Weekly. He worked for The Age as a reporter and feature writer and spent several years at the ABC, where he was a TV producer on Media Watch and 7:30 Report, and an editor on The Drum, which is again another one of my favorites. Today he will discuss the conversation we need to have. The story of how The Conversation, the media organisation, has successfully done this and grown into one of the largest independent media organisations in the world. I hope you agree with me that it's our great pleasure to have Misha here today, and we welcome you to give us your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just make sure I can. How do I click onto my slides? Is there a...
Click on the right.
On the...
Oh yeah, this one. You'll have a... No. This one? No.
If not the right arrow, should.
Here we go.
Yeah, it's now working.
Beautiful.
Use that as a laser pointer.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to start also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of a background of the history that led to the formation of The Conversation. But to do that, I think I need to talk a little bit about what's happening in the media world currently in terms of the way the media world is changing in public communication. And I guess from my perspective, the key thing to start off with is we really are talking about a story of media failure. We have seen in the past 10 to 15 years a really strong trend globally of declining trust in media. That's been mirrored by a general trend in declining trust in organisations, whether it be governments, other public sector institutions, but in particular the media has suffered. The latest Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out every year, shows the trend of declining trust in media continuing. Currently, trust in the media is at somewhere around 31%, according to the Edelman Barometer. That's incredibly low. As someone who spent my career really at the coalface of this change, I just want to tell you a few stories about what I've seen happening, where I think the key failures lie, and a little bit about what I think we can do about it. I'd like to start by going back to the 2010 federal election, during which I was working for the ABC on Media Watch. I'll never forget that election because there was what I think of as quite a pivotal moment during that campaign when there was a policy that was launched which was around funding for people with disabilities. And as usual during an election campaign, there were political reporters who were on buses reporting every utterance of every political leader. And the types of stories you got around the announcement of that disability policy were talking about things like, this will play well in Western Sydney, this will play well with this type of voter, this will play well with that type of voter. And there was a guy called Greg Jericho who contacted the ABC and said, this media reporting has failed me. And the reason it's failed me is because nobody's told me what the policy is actually going to do. And I've got a daughter with a disability and I want to know what the policy actually is. I want to know how it will affect me, how it will affect my life, whether I'll qualify for funding, what the actual, the information is behind this. But what had happened was the journalists reporting it had got so carried away by what we call horse race reporting, which is where you report things as a conflict, one side, another side, he said, she said, and you stand above it and pretend you're somehow entirely objective and sort of savvy and knowing and yet not engaged in it. That basically the key information wasn't getting across. At the same time, during the course of that year, a very well-known American journalism academic by the name of Jay Rosen came out and spoke to staff at the ABC. And he also said, look, I think that the media is broken. And one of the reasons I think it's broken is because I'm reading lots of news stories and I can't understand often what they're about. And he pointed to a story that had been on the front page of the newspaper that day and was about the NBN. And it had, I think the opposition of the day was saying, the NBN policy is bad or it's good, and the government was saying the opposite, and it had sort of he said, she said, and you got to the end of the story and it actually made no sense to anybody. And you'll see that a lot when you read media stories. Unless you actually knew what the proposals were for the NBN, what fibre to the node was, how it worked, the history of the policies, the background, the real information, no reader was left having read that story in a situation where they were in any way meaningfully informed and able to make a judgment about that. And Jay Rosen said, I think the problem is this. It's as though the media are producing cassette tapes, but nobody's got a cassette recorder. Nobody's being given the information they need to actually decode what they're being told. It was a really important and useful message. And after that, some useful initiatives came about, including, and I'm just going to jump forward a bit, but the conversation several years later set up a fact check unit to provide really detailed background information on key policy issues. The ABC did the same, so did Peter Fray with a project called ProPublica. And there has been, I think, a genuine media attempt to respond to this issue. But the truth remains that in terms of quality information, we are still being relatively poorly served. One of the ways in which we've seen that sort of borne out in public discussion is last year there was a Senate inquiry into what's termed public interest journalism. And that was really trying to address the problem of the collapse of the business models that support what we call public interest journalism. And I think for people in Australia, in particular, people in Melbourne, but also in Sydney, Fairfax is a really good example. You've seen in the past 10 years, there's been more than 3,000 journalists across the country who've lost their jobs. You've seen once hugely staffed, really rich newspapers that landed on your doorstep on a Saturday morning, they were this fat, go to the point where they're this thin. The reason that's happened really is because the way in which quality journalism used to be funded was an accident of history. It used to be that if you wanted to buy a car or buy a house or get a job, the only way you could do it was by accessing a newspaper. And the only people who actually could provide newspapers were people with the money to buy these big multi-million-dollar printing presses. So they had near monopoly control of their markets. So generally in the markets, there are only one or two major players. And what happened was from particularly classified advertising, jobs, cars, houses, there were massive revenue streams that newspapers used to fund what we would call public interest journalism. And that gave us things like the considered essays, the book reviews, the arts coverage, the detailed explanatory science coverage, all of the things that made newspapers really rich and gave us all this wonderful quality journalism. As that business model collapsed under digital disruption, basically what happened was those newspapers shrank and whole areas of reporting that we once saw effectively disappeared. So one of the issues when people talk about public interest journalism in Australia is that they tend to want to talk about the big high profile aspects of journalism, the big investigations. But I think there are other parts of what we're missing out on in terms of the journalism ecosystem that are even more important. And I'd just like to read to you briefly from my submission to that Senate inquiry, which in the end went nowhere because a lot of the senators got into trouble and it got disbanded and sort of turned into a bit of a damp squib. But I think there are sort of important issues here I just want to raise. Discussion of public interest journalism tends to focus on the role of journalists in holding power to account. Big investigations like Moonlight State or Watergate most readily spring to mind. This high-profile work is vital, but there is another role for quality journalism that is even more fundamental. Journalists provide quality information that helps people understand the world around them and make informed decisions. Reliable information is essential for healthy democracy, but it does so much more than help us take part in public debate or decide how to vote. It also helps us decide what to eat to stay healthy, or how to keep our children safe online, or how to avoid the risks of problem gambling. Public interest journalism can provide essential context to help people make sense of a complex and confusing barrage of information. Quality information makes markets more efficient. It provides essential insights that help us understand our environment, our culture, our history. It underpins the health and well-being of society. For example, when it first became clear tobacco was a lethal product, it was public interest media that reported the dangers. Simultaneously, tobacco companies redirected massive budgets to spread doubt so people would keep smoking. Vested interests set out to present the clear science as subject to debate. They were able to delay policy responses and stop people quitting. In the digital age, in which social media supports dissemination of content without any regard to its accuracy, the task of muddying the waters on matters of great public importance is simpler and cheaper than ever before. There is a deluge of information, but it is increasingly difficult for audiences to know what to trust. The destruction of the business model that supports quality journalism has created a digital public sphere where there are more voices than ever before, but it is also infected with misinformation. This is why preserving and protecting the role of public interest journalism is vital. And to achieve this, we need to define public interest journalism in a way that reflects the breadth of what public interest journalism really is. The independent dissemination of trustworthy information that has been filtered and assessed by journalism professionals. So that's sort of my sense of really where we are and where the problem is. And just to give you one more example to give a sense of that, the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, is currently holding an inquiry into the role of digital platforms in changing our media landscape. And one of the things they've been looking at, which I think is very important, is the role of Google and Facebook. If you think about the way newspapers used to work, there were sort of editors and journalists as gatekeepers. So you might have a health reporter, for example, working at a major newspaper. And if you get some research that says cleaning your teeth 6 times a day is necessary to prevent tooth decay, but it's sponsored by Colgate, you might take that research with a degree of necessary skepticism and change the way that you handle it. What happens now is everyone can go direct to the public because everyone's getting their information via social media and Google. And the information you can trust and the disinformation is all jumbled up together. The way that Google and Facebook have responded to this criticism is to say they're going to invest in increasing what they call digital literacy, which basically is a way of saying we've created this almighty problem where we don't know what information to trust, and the way we're going to fix it is to put it back on the consumer to work out what to trust. I'm going to come to this in a minute, but the conversation was sort of founded really as a way of being part of the solution to that problem, of really creating a space of information that you know is trustworthy, and making sure that readers and audiences understand why that information can be trusted. I'd like to give you another couple of quick examples of the media failure before moving on to talking about the ways in which we're trying to work to sort of solve that problem. One of which is from not very long after I joined the conversation after leaving Media Watch. And I'll never forget it. It'll be quite pertinent to many people here. I saw a story in the Daily Telegraph, and it was a story about some research done by an academic at the University of Technology in Sydney. And she had been looking at the question of whether a young infant of under 1 year of age, if they were in a pram facing outwards as opposed to a pram facing their parent or guardian, they would be subject to excessive stimulation, so would be overstimulated by all the things that they would see. And I'll never forget, I read this story in the Daily Telegraph, and it had the headline, academic says outward facing prams are cruel. And I thought to myself, I'll bet you anything that the academic didn't say that. So the first thing I did, of course, having worked at Media Watch and having had a lot of these conversations with people who were used to being misquoted by newspapers, was I rang her up and I said, what happened? She said, look, I'm so glad you rang. I spent a lot of time on this research project. I was specifically clear with the journalist that I wasn't saying that outward-facing prams were cruel at all. This was preliminary research looking at the level of stimulation, and it did find some evidence that if your child is facing outwards, there is a greater level of stimulation, and that may be problematic, but that was all. And I was very careful about my language and the way I pitched that story, yet this is the headline we got. And I thought to myself, it's interesting, why has that happened? And the reason that happens is this: because journalism is expensive and much journalism is run by commercial enterprises, you put public broadcasters to one side. Basically what media organisations are trying to do is they're trying to attract audiences. To attract audiences, you try to frame things in the ways that are the most interesting according to your journalistic training. And if you've been trained in a tabloid media culture, one of the first things you learn is that conflict is inherently interesting and it will sell, it will attract more attention. So what you have built in the media models is a bias towards the shrill, towards the opinionated, towards information that is not carefully balanced or considered in a way so as best to inform people, but almost information as entertainment, infotainment. And that's where you get the corruption in many times of quality information. But having said that, there are very real skills that media practitioners have that they can use to help you share your research and share your ideas and get it across to a large audience, but without doing any violence to the complexity of the ideas. One of the early conversations that led to the founding of the conversation as a project was with one of the conversation's founders, Andrew Jaspin, and Peter Doherty. And he was talking to Peter Doherty, and Peter Doherty said to him, I'm just sick to death of doing interviews with reporters, because they come along and they sit across the desk from me and they ask me all these questions in sort of a slightly aggressive manner, and then they go away and they write their articles. And I think to myself, how bad is it going to be? How badly is the information going to be twisted or misrepresented? How much explaining am I going to have to do in the corridors tomorrow to my colleagues to explain, I didn't say that, I didn't mean this? And Peter said, what would happen if instead of having this model which is based on conflict, where somebody who really doesn't know what they're talking about misinterprets my information, what if I had a journalist working with me to help me write up my ideas, polish my ideas in a collaborative manner so we could actually communicate the nuance and communicate the ideas in a sophisticated way? And that conversation with Peter Doherty was the germ of the idea that led to the founding of the conversation, which is what I'm going to talk about now. The idea of the conversation is to work only with academic authors, researchers, people with real expertise, but to work with them in a collaborative manner to share their ideas with the widest possible audience. It was founded in Melbourne here, not very far from here, in 2011. In the 7 to 8 years we've been operating, it's become a huge global network. There are now teams in the UK, the US, Africa, France, Spain, Canada, Indonesia, New Zealand, and there are a couple more we're talking to. And it's terrific to see that an idea out of Australia has actually started to have this level of influence and success. And partly, to be honest, I think the times have suited us. We are in a situation where there's all this talk of fake news and misinformation and media failure, and we can see all the ways in which it's very, very hard to distinguish the information that you can rely upon. And our whole model is based on information you can trust. The fundamental ways we do that, we only work with academics and researchers. We only work with academics and researchers who are working within their area of expertise. Although we allow and don't discourage academics and researchers from expressing opinions, we're not publishing articles because of the opinions. What we're trying to do is ensure that every time we publish an article, people know more about the topic than when they started reading the article. What we're wanting to do is surface the evidence so that people can be well informed. It's really about an informing the public type of project. Every single article we publish has a link to the academic and has a full history of their publications, their biography, so that readers can assess their level of expertise on the topic they're writing about. Every academic that writes for us has to fill out a disclosure statement. Any conflicts of interest, any funding from Colgate, anything else that might relevantly impact on the credibility of their research, so that the readers can know that the information they're reading is information they can trust. And the other thing we do on the flip side of that is we work with academics and researchers to get their information and their ideas out there. But we aren't trying, unlike many media outlets, to corral all the information in one space and sell advertising. We're funded by universities and philanthropy and a range of other sources, which I'll touch on. But basically that means that we can give the information away for free. So every academic that writes an article for us, we give 3 or 4 articles to the ABC every day that they republish. Our articles are published in Fairfax Media, West Australian, Washington Post, New York Times. All over the world, we give away our quality edited information. And the reason that we do that is because we think it's vital for democracy to have that quality information out there in the public sphere. So I've just touched on very briefly the story behind the ways in which the conversation was founded and why it was founded. We're now produced in 4 languages. We may soon be produced in Portuguese, so there might be a 5th, and that gives you a bit of a general sense of how we're growing. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of our size, the conversation, when you count republishers, and the way we count republishers is if somebody republishes one of our articles digitally, they take a little bit of code and we can report back how many people read it. So if the Washington Post republishes an article from the conversation, we can report back to the author how many people have read that article on the Washington Post. The benefit of that is we do get a good proxy of the readership. The downside is it underestimates the readership because a lot of republishers republish and don't take the code. But when you count readers with republishers according to our code numbers, we're getting around about 35 million unique browsers or reads a month. If you compare that to something like, say, the ABC's audited figures, it gets about 4.7 million. That's Australian readers to the Australian content. So it is a very big global network and it's growing very, very rapidly. This is just a little bit from Ian Jacobs, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of New South Wales and has also recently joined the Conversations Board. In a media world experiencing disruptive change, the conversation stands out as an exemplar of informed, knowledge-based communication. And there's a little bit there about our charter. These slides will be available if anybody wants them at any point in the future. But basically what we are fundamentally about is journalistic independence, an unbiased approach, and really trying to serve the public with quality information. I mean, they're really our key goals. Just a little bit of detail about how we go about doing this. One way is we have this thing called a collaborative editing platform. And what that means is that we can't publish an article without the approval of the academic author. It's really fundamental to trust. So you submit an article to us as an editor. Part of my role is to be a bridge to make sure that some of the technical aspects of the work that you've done are understandable to a general reader and are going to engage a general reader. So what I might do is rewrite parts of that article to hopefully explain concepts clearly, increase clarity to help you get your message across. The problem is that when I do that, there's a risk I'm going to get something wrong. I'm going to misunderstand something. I'm going to make a mistake. So in our system, unlike newspapers and most other media outlets, we don't let anything go out until the academic author of the piece has seen and approved. On our system, you'll see the approval button on the top right of the screen, those 3 green buttons, until the author has approved the piece. And basically, as part of that, we ask that authors look at the photo, the caption, the headline, and every single word. Because if you set yourself up to rebuild trust in media, one of the things you don't want to do is corrode that trust by making mistakes. So that's a key part of our approach. Another thing that we do is we try to provide tools to help experts communicate clearly. There are lots of things that you learn over a long time working in journalism, things to avoid like acronyms and clunky language. We have a saying in the office, which is you should never disembark a vehicle if you can get out of a car. And one of the things that we do is we have this readability index, which is, I think it's based on the Flesch-Kincaid index, which basically counts how many words and syllables in every sentence. And the idea is to incentivize authors to write in really clear language, really short sentences to get their ideas across. That thing, which is actually currently green, goes to amber if you're using words that are too long and your sentences are too long, and it goes to red if you're really verbose. And the idea is often we will encourage academics, will say, look, it's still in the amber zone, you need to do a bit more work to make it go to green. But again, it's about communicating ideas clearly. This is just a quick thing of our disclosure statements. So every author is asked to fill in this disclosure statement. It really goes to consultancy work, funding, anything that might create a perceived conflict. If there is a conflict, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't write. That's a judgment call. I mean, if you've been funded by Big Ben and your findings are that, you know, Big Ben dog food is the best thing ever, we might steer clear of that article, even though there might be processes around it that, you know, people would claim it's sort of academically independent and rigorous. But there are plenty of times, like for example, in immunology, where it would be very hard to find an immunologist who hasn't received some funding from companies working in that field. But those people would, in many cases, still be in a position to write something really informative with a disclosure. Okay. So I just want to just mention a little bit, just going back to that idea I was talking about before, about the media producing cassette tapes when people really need cassette recorders. This is an idea that we worked on for quite some time to really try to make a bit of sense of cancer research. You're all experts in this field, so I present this with some trepidation because I'm sure there'll be somebody that will find something that we've got wrong with it. But basically, I was noticing that I was reading in the newspaper every second day a new story about cancer risk. It'd say if you eat salami, it increases your cancer risk by X, and if you do this, it increases it by Y, and if you do this. And I thought, none of this actually makes any sense, because unless you know what your risk is to start off with, if you've got an infinitesimally small risk and it doubles, it's still not particularly meaningful in terms of making decisions about whether to eat salami or not, for example. So I had this idea, which was, why don't we work with a cancer research expert and try to create an interactive where basically you can work out what your lifetime risk is of a certain kind of cancer, so say bowel cancer or lung cancer or skin cancer or whatever it is, and look at the way that different lifestyle factors influence that risk and make it interactive, so you can click on a certain organ on your body and you can actually get that information. We spent 6 months working with Ian Olver on this project and many other academics, because we spent a lot of time checking our information to make sure it was accurate. And you'll see here that particular project has had almost 1.5 million reads. And that's a global audience. And you also see here a little bit of an example of some of the reach of the republishers. So IFL Science is less so now, but it used to be a really huge international science website that used to get massive audiences. This was republished by the Daily Mail, that's from our on-site readership, Business Insider, ABC, New Zealand Herald. But that's an example of trying to really step up to the journalistic task of producing the cassette recorder, producing this sort of the way that people can make sense of the little bits of information that come at you in really difficult to decode ways. The other thing is, this is just a little bit about our author profiles. Again, the way in which we try to make it clear to our readers who is talking. Again, it really goes back to this question of rebuilding trust, and in particular, rebuilding trust in experts. It's important to know who's talking if you're talking about digital literacy and what information you can trust. And we try to be as transparent as possible with our academic authors. This is just to give you a little look. This is the author dashboard. This is a little bit based on this concept called gamification, which is trying to provide ways to encourage people to do things you want them to do. And as a journalist, I'm always slightly nervous about it, because I always feel that when people are intrinsically motivated, when they really want to do something, that's when you get the very best work. But part of this is really to provide tools for academic authors to engage with their audiences and to understand how to do public engagement. So every author who writes an article for us gets a dashboard. They can see in what countries their articles are being read. They can see how many readers on each article. They can see all the comments. Comments across the media, as you'll probably know, are very, to be kind, variable in quality. But one of the things that can really improve that is if the authors of articles get involved and you try to seed the conversation with some serious, intelligent contributions. So we provide details on comments to encourage authors that want to engage with their readers. We also provide feedbacks of latest tweets, latest Facebook posts, just so that as an author, you've got a way of going to one place and monitoring all of the interaction and all of the engagement that is coming as a result of that piece being published. It's just a little bit about the republishing model. So you can see some of the republishers we work with. There's more than 20,000 sites that republish our content. And we're continually working to grow that and build really strong relationships. We, until fairly recently, had a staff member from the ABC embedded in our newsroom full-time to ensure that the work that we were doing was tying in with what the ABC is doing, so that they would continue to take a large stream of our content. They're still doing that. We're just doing it in a slightly different way now with a team in Sydney, and we're also building a stronger relationship with SBS and many other republishers. So now, from the point of view of the public, I think it's easy to see why having experts engaging in public discourse and not withdrawing from it is important. I think we can see all of the issues with media failure, declining trust in institutions, declining trust in experts. But I just want to talk a little bit about, you know, as researchers and academics, what the benefits are in terms of this sort of public participation, because it's a question you often get. Just first of all, you can see, again, these are the figures for our overall audience. You can see where we are globally, and you can just see a little bit here about the way in which the audience is growing very, very quickly. This is just a little bit of general information about our readers. Again, I'll make this available afterwards. One of the things that's interesting about a digital-only publishing model like The Conversation is it's actually quite young. More than 50% of our audience is, 69% of our audience is under 44. Compare that with the ABC, which has an average audience age, I think, of 65. Average audience age. And you can see that there is an advantage in that as well, because the way people are consuming media now is so different, and reaching those people who are younger audiences is very, very valuable. But I just want to talk a little bit about this, which is the impact for authors when they write for The Conversation. One of the things that happens almost immediately, and in most cases, is media follow-up. So this is an author who ended up appearing on the project. She also sent us something saying that when she wrote her article, her altmetric score improved. There's a massive world out there. You probably all know a lot more about it than I do, about impact and engagement and the ways in which you measure that. I don't want to say too much about it because I'll get tripped up on the technicalities of it, but suffice to say, one thing that's very important academically is obviously trying to drive the level of citations to your work. One thing we encourage academics to do is when they've got an article coming out in a peer-reviewed journal, to write a piece for us, which generally can be like a plain language version of it. What that then does is it drives readers back to the journal article, and it can increase the number of people accessing it, the number of citations. You can get other flow-on benefits from that. The media work in itself, some people love it, some people don't. You know, it is important to share the expertise and share the ideas. And I think that's valuable as an end in itself, but I think it's also to be aware of some of the other benefits. And increasingly, research bodies like the ARC, the NHMRC, all over the world are really looking at impact and demonstration of impact from research that's being funded. So it's important to have these. I'm not going to say too much about this one. It's mostly, I think, about media follow-up, but just to go to the next one, one of the other things that's really important for academics and experts is engagement in public policy. Often the expertise that you have can surface the evidence in ways that can importantly illustrate things that are topics of public debate. So I was recently in Perth doing some presentations to universities in Perth, and I was going through, we've got a little box where you can contact the author if you want to engage with them, and I saw that Bill Shorten had contacted one of our authors to ask about some research that she had done. I think it was about housing policy, housing affordability debates. Increasingly, we're seeing our content read out in Parliament. There's been many instances of that happening, forming the basis of submission to different government inquiries. We're being told by a lot of staffers in Parliament House that they're using many of our articles to brief ministers because they provide very handy plain language versions on topics of controversy or public policy, because we are doing so much of our commissioning off the news agenda. So if your work does sort of intersect with public discourse, public debate, the conversation is a really, really good way of getting engaged in that discussion, not just because you get not just the readership on the conversation, but the readership through the republication as well, but also because we know it's being very well read by policymakers. And you can see a little bit here also just about general media follow-up. It's really important to be aware the conversation is very well read by other journalists. So not just for republication, but also for interview opportunities for other ways of engaging with the content. That gives you a bit of a statistical background to that information about people being followed up. Look, I might leave it there. Apart from just one thing, I should just talk very briefly about how we work and the streams of content, just so that you're all sort of aware of the types of things that we do and the types of things that you can do. We work like any other newsroom. We start the day with a news conference, and we're looking at every single issue in the news. So last week, I was looking at what was happening with this report into religious schools and whether they could fire gay staff or expel gay students, for example. And we had some terrific academics who wrote a piece. They were legal scholars about anti-discrimination legislation across the country, which was really something we needed right then. Now, that story came out in the middle of the day on Wednesday. We had initial leaks. Basically, I was in the office saying to our politics editor, if these leaks are strong enough that we can rely upon them accurately, we need to have something up in a couple of hours. We had that piece up, 10 o'clock that night. And that's the sort of media cycle you're working on sometimes. You're responding really quickly to the news. The example I always give is when Fukushima happened, not long after we launched, we got an academic who was an expert on the impact of radiation on the human body. He did an article for us and then spent the following week doing every single TV and radio station pretty much in the country, because everybody needed somebody to fill a little spot in their stories explaining that topic. And the conversation is a great way, if you've got relevant expertise and something in the news, of putting your hand up to the rest of the media and saying, I know about this, I can be useful, I can help inform people. So there's one sort of stream which is off the news, and that can be things like fact checks as well. If you ever see anything in the public sphere that misrepresents the science, that gets it wrong, that's always a good point at which to contact us. The second stream is new research. So we're constantly looking for new research and wanting to report new research accurately. As I was saying, particularly if you've got articles coming out in refereed journals, it's always a good time to contact us. The third stream of content that we have is what we call editorial products. In the old days, they used to be called furniture. So I don't know if anybody reads Good Weekend magazine. Can we read that? Okay, so there's the little thing at the front called The Two of Us, right? That's what you call editorial furniture. It's a way of framing an editorial product that readers get to know and they might get to enjoy it and engage with it. We're constantly creating what we call editorial products. So we created one not long ago called Curious Kids, where children between the ages of 6 and 12 writing with a question they've always wanted an answer to. We've had a fantastic response to that product. The ABC's now produced it into a podcast series, so there's like an audio version of it. We get a massive readership for those. And for those types of things, part of what we're trying to do is reinforce the role of the expert as a valuable part of society by showing young people that if you want to know about a particular thing, there is a professor or a researcher or somebody you can go to who can actually tell you, who can actually help with that. We have a lot of other products. We've got explainers. We've got a thing called Friday Essay, which is a longer piece. We're constantly developing those. But if you sign up and have a bit of a look at some of our content, you can get a sense of what some of those are. And if you're interested in writing, you know, and you don't have a piece of new research you want to pitch, often a good way to start getting involved in that public communication is to do something like one of those products where you can use your expertise to explain and inform the public. I think I've gone for about 45 minutes, which is what I was told I had, and I did want to leave some time for questions. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
Start with a round of applause. Thank you, Misha. Thanks very much for that really insightful introduction to the work you do there. I'll take questions from the floor. I might start by asking one question, which is, you say you take pieces from academics. What about experts who might work for a company, but who might be the most knowledgeable person in that area? Where do you draw the line? Must they have an academic affiliation to contribute?
Yes, yeah. So basically, one of the difficulties we faced when founding the conversation was how to draw a line around that, like where you draw that line. And wherever you draw that line, there's always going to be people who are potentially could contribute, who will miss out. But we decided that drawing that line very tightly was very important, both partly because we're funded by universities and our role is to get that work out there, but partly because it also made it really clear what we're doing and what the mission is. So we do sometimes get criticism from retired academics, for example, who can't write for us. You've got to have a current affiliation with a university or a research institution. But we are quite strict about those rules because they sort of go to the core credibility of what we're trying to do.
Okay. Do you have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thanks.
If you're being paid by the universities, why are you always asking for people who receive your daily email for money?
That's a good question. So the university funding that we get covers roughly half our operating costs. In Australia, there's 39, I mean, depending on how you count them, but roughly 39 public universities, and they all provide annual funding, and it's sort of on a tiered system. But from the universities, we get about $2.2 million a year, and it costs us about $4.5 million a year to run. So we have to make up the rest of that, and we make up a substantial portion of that through donations. A lot of media organisations are doing this now. The Guardian, it's sort of quite a big model. We get around about 500,000 to 700,000 from donations, and then we also have a jobs board. We make some money from that, and we seek philanthropic contributions, and we make some money from that. And basically, we spend a lot of our time asking for and trying to raise money.
Yes, and front here.
Thanks very much.
I'll just grab you the mic.
Thank you, Virginia Regoni. Enjoyed your presentation, and certainly thanks for your insights. You mentioned that the ACCC is currently running an inquiry into digital platforms in the context of its, competition policy. Can you comment on what you're hoping to see and what you believe will change, if anything, from the inquiry with respect to the large platforms? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to give you a very disappointing answer. I think nothing will change. I think the reality is that the Googles and Facebooks of this world are global companies that are based in America, and they're very responsive to American domestic political pressure. So I don't know if you saw Mark Zuckerberg was up before Congress at one point, I think, a few months ago. But somewhere like Australia, there's lip service paid, but I don't think there's any real commitment to, for example, funding public interest journalism. What happens is when they get criticised, they set up new projects in the US, the Trust Project, this, that, and they fund these philanthropic organisations that help get legislators off their back in the US. and they have done some things in Europe because the European Union has been very hard on Google in a good way, and that has led to some change. But I wouldn't be particularly optimistic. I think the ACCC has done a really good job of expanding the terms of reference, of not just thinking about, because generally the ACCC will often think from the point of view of competition for advertising revenue, like sort of a business model approach. But they have really been looking at the competition for journalism, like how journalism is funded. And I think they've done a really good job. Rod Sims has made a real effort. I just don't see how a regulator like the ACCC in Australia can force meaningful changes. I think it's going to be tough.
Now, question here.
In the meantime, while the mic is coming there, can I just get a quick show of hands? Who's an academic affiliate who's here because of their interest in reading or contributing? Right, and who's a member of the general public who's interested in the media contributions? Okay, so it's a little bit half-half. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. Timothy Lee, I read the conversation. I think it's very high quality content. But given the success of this and the expansion, let's say you have 34 million readers, that's quite some scale that you could achieve over traditional content producers. But is the business model therefore immune to, does its integrity become vulnerable? I mean, we've seen, to be quite cynical, that a lot of institutions have been captured by sectional interests. It doesn't matter whether or not it's an executive branch of an Anglo-Sphere democracy. It doesn't matter if it's universities here, Ramsey Foundation, etc. Why is this model always going to be safe?
That's a good question. So we've got a lot of policies and procedures that guarantee editorial integrity and editorial independence. And basically, the way it works is like a big global franchising model. So if you want to set up in the UK, for example, you've got to agree to sign up to all our editorial policies, all our processes, author sign-off, only working with academics, independence, academic oversight, an editorial board, complaints handling procedures, all of those rules around it. And every part of the network is responsible ultimately to Australia, to TCMG, which created the model and the licensing of the model. And if anybody did anything that was going to impact negatively on our reputation, we would take very hasty action, because it's all based around this trust, and that's very fragile and it's very important to us. So, in each country, like the UK conversation, there's UK universities that support it. They've got their own board, they've got their own sort of corporate governance structures, but they are also ultimately accountable to us. And we think that provides, very good protection.
Ian over there.
Were there any microphones? So I guess
I think it's for our online listeners. Thanks, Ian.
So we're all looking at the US, I think, or many of us with despair, at the lack of informed public debate, the rampant mistrust of any notion of sort of excellence, academic excellence and authority. I'm wondering what, you didn't seem to mention the US very much in terms of your international impact. So I'm wondering if you are sort of making any impact there, either with the readership or with partnerships with academia.
Yes, we've got a team in the US based in Boston. There's about 15 or 20 editors, I think, and the audience is growing quickly. It's a different space because in the US there's a lot more philanthropic journalism. There are a lot more organisations like ProPublica, for example, that are trying to provide quality interest journalism and are working with media organisations. So, and it's a different sort of competitive landscape. I think we've been able to achieve a much higher level of market penetration in Australia much more quickly, to be honest, because we have fewer competing media outlets. The quality of the media isn't as good, it's not as diverse. But they are going very well. They've got a couple of editors based in New York. They've got some on the West Coast. I can't remember exactly where. It's been going for about 3.5 years now, and it's growing very quickly. So, and we are working on that. The difficulty with America is not so much necessarily the journalistic model, it's also the way the university system works there. It's quite complicated, and the very top tier universities and the very bottom tier universities, there's a wide gap in between. There's a massive number of universities. The UK is a little bit more like Australia, a bit more constrained in terms of really top public universities that you can work with. But yeah, we are working in the US.
Yeah, it's just a question behind you.
Got a question about how you deal with conflicts with interpretation of the data, where you might have the evidence, but the actual academic debate is quite conflicted. We know that science has a small but large percentage where there's revolution, where sometimes the consensus may not have been the correct model, and later down the track that it's actually revised. So how do you deal with those types of conflicts?
I think the short answer is with great difficulty. We're not scientists, we're not experts. So our role is to be, to some extent, like umpires in terms of trying to present the diversity of views credibly and give everybody a chance to have their say. So if something is particularly contentious or debated, like one of the things that we will do as journalists is we'll take a piece of work and go to 3 or 4 other academics and say, what do you think about this? Are there issues, are there questions? And often if there are 2 equally credible but dissenting points of view, we'll commission both. We'll run 2 pieces on the same topic, or we will host a debate, or we'll find a way to actually allow that debate to occur. I mean, it's not our job to ever come down on a particular side of an argument. Our job is to present well-sourced, rigorously argued pieces that are based on the evidence. That doesn't mean that, I mean, there are human beings making decisions, and there are still ways in which, I think everybody needs to guard against being complacent about echoing the orthodoxy, in that the prevailing set of views always very much frame what you think, and it's very hard to think outside those and to keep a properly open mind. But yeah, we sort of try to facilitate the discussion as much as possible.
Has anyone here contributed to the conversation? Yeah, can I ask you to share just a few words of your experience, what you liked, were you nervous, what happened after?
Sure. I was a PhD student at the time, and my primary supervisor was contacted by one of the editors, I think, in the conversation to contribute to the series you did on Australian endangered species.
Okay.
And in a nutshell, he couldn't be bothered and didn't have the time, so it got passed to me to write the 2 pieces.
Okay.
And it was a really good experience.
Yeah, and did you find it easy, difficult? Did you kind of stew on it for a long time? Did the editors help you through it?
From what I remember, the editor was helpful in bringing our language down into that green zone that you mentioned. So just making it readable, because my first bash at it was probably really unreadable. So yeah, that was helpful. And
was there any flow-on effect in terms of people contacting you, or was it a kind of structured piece there?
No, I think I remember getting the report in email, the follow-up email saying that the reach was considerable, but I don't remember. Yeah, I didn't get nothing like that.
Yeah. It's not quite the NDN.
No.
Do we have any other questions? Did you have a contribution as well? No, sorry. Great. Well, look, feel free to come up and ask Misha some other questions. He'll be around for a little bit, I'm sure. But anyway, just leaves to thank Misha for a great presentation, really insightful stuff. Thank you.